Does art have a duty to inculcate the correct morality in us? Or perhaps a weaker claim, does the content of art need to deal with the content of correct or good or politically correct morality in order for it to be classified as good art? Do moral flaws count towards artistic or aesthetic flaws in art? What is the relationship between art and morality? These are questions that have long interested me personally, and the reason why I'm making a video on this was basically last term I had a supervision question set on this in my paper on aesthetics, and the question was, are all moral flaws artistic flaws? Basically, in preparation for this essay, I've read a series of different stances on the relationship between immorality and artistic virtue. As a summary of my own position, I would say it is not the case that all moral flaws are artistic flaws. And note that as a matter of philosophical technicality, there's some debate in the field of aesthetics whether aesthetic virtue and artistic virtue are the same thing. So some people think they're just interchangeable terms, but others think aestheticism is something attributed to the artwork, but artistic merit or demerit is something that you attribute to the artist. But I'm not someone to say how to use these terms, but for the sake of this video and in my essay, let's just say I'm just using them relatively on equal terms. So basically my position is that I align with a position called the moderate autonomist, and I'll explain this later in the video. I posit that moral and artistic, or whatever you choose to call it, aesthetic merits and demerits are completely two separate categories of evaluation that should not be put together. You can't directly equivalize a flaw or a merit in one area to the other. And the structure of this video will follow the structure of my essay, which is, in the first section, I give a detailed exposition of what we define as virtues and vices in the moral versus aesthetic spheres. The second section considers the ethicist and moderate moralist position, which posit that either all or some moral flaws are simultaneously also aesthetic flaws. I shall refute each of their main arguments and point out that some of the claims they make are in fact inconsistent with the definition of what aesthetic value is in an artwork, as outlined in section 1. The third section gives the moderate autonomist perspective to explain why moral and aesthetic defects can be unrelated despite the fact that a moral vision may be one of the most integral parts to a work. Finally, I offer a possibility on how the representation of an immoral perspective may sometimes lay the ground for attributing artistic merit to the work. Firstly, let's start with defining merits and demerits in the moral versus aesthetic realms. As we know, normative moral standards are very diverse, so it's very hard to give a definitive definition of what people count as morally correct. So as a broad summary, I would say the object of ethical judgment is usually our other regarding feelings and actions, although the precise content of what qualifies as good or bad may differ slightly in different systems of morality. For the sake of this essay, I don't aim to define what is good or bad, so I will take as accepted what the majority of society deem as good or bad. These are the values that we'll be working with when we evaluate whether an artwork is expressing moral or immoral views. Now, we reach a more complex question, which is, what are aesthetic virtues? And this in itself would be the content deserving of another whole long essay, which I've actually written on, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to offer my own current interpretation of what aesthetic virtues are. I'm not saying this is the correct definition, but it's just what I personally think would work well as a preliminary definition and also for the purposes of this essay. So firstly, I have written, I believe that aesthetic virtues or merits are traits possessed by the work of art which enhance its aesthetic value, the latter defined as the intended capacity of the work in question to promote aesthetic experience. Yet the more difficult question is what the aesthetic experience encompasses. A formalist definition takes this experience as a disinterested pleasure derived from the appreciation of the formal aspects of artworks, and this is too narrow. Neither is a definition of aesthetic value of art being its value as an artwork, aka the idea of art qua art, illustrative enough for our purposes. What I see as a key function of art is its role of defamiliarization. As Viktor Shklovsky writes, art allows us to return to the sensation of life, to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. The device of art is the estrangement of things and the complication of the form, with the explicit purpose of deautomatizing perception. So I've also quoted this passage in my previous video linked here. And yeah, I'm kind of pretty into the idea of defamiliarization. But to clarify its actual application, let's consider the range of things that it could actually do via an artwork. So, for example, it could enlighten us to the previously unnoticed beauties around us, to sensitize our sympathies to marginalized groups of people that we were not aware of before. Or it can teach us a certain moral or political perspective. However, I wish to stress that for defamiliarization to occur, these intentions must be executed with some sort of artistic skill or excellence. It's no artistic value if someone just writes "helping others is good" on a pamphlet and distributes it around. So this concept that artistic execution is crucial to achieving what art does will remain central to my argument. Now let's consider the positions of my opponents, so people who take the stance of ethicism or moderate moralism. The ethicist claims that all moral flaws are artistic flaws in an artwork, while the moderate moralist thinks that some flaws are. So now before I delve into a deeper discussion, I need to make an initial clarification. I quote this from an essay called Robust Immoralism by A.W. Eaton. Moral judgment is intrinsic to a work, just in case moral judgment is among the responses prescribed by the work, that is, when moral judgment is a component of the work's perspective. On the other hand, moral judgment is extrinsic to a work, just in case moral judgment is not a component of the work's perspective, that is, moral judgment is not among the responses prescribed by the work, but this perspective is nevertheless subject to second-order moral approval or disapproval. What I wish to clarify with this is that we're only dealing with intrinsic moral judgments, so the judgment that is actually promoted or prescribed by the work, when we're saying that the moral virtue or flaw can become an aesthetic virtue or flaw. One of the key tenets of the ethicist and moderate moralists is called the merited response argument, and I have outlined it in my essay as such. As part of providing the audience with aesthetic experience, a work aims to evoke certain cognitive affective responses in the audience. This sort of response allows the reader or viewer to access some sort of cognitive insight conveyed in the work via means of an emotional response they form towards it. The merited response argument contends that moral defects in a work, notably prescribing immoral cognitive affective responses, are aesthetic flaws. It asks people to respond to the work in a way contrary to their moral sensibilities. As a result, the response prescribed is unwarranted or unmerited because people are obstructed from formulating the response, say, that of sympathy to a psychopathic killer dictated by the author. When the work fails to elicit its prescribed response, it fails aesthetically, such as how a moral flaw becomes an artistic flaw. Basically, the argument is saying that the moral flaw serves as an obstruction to the audience to basically engage effectively, cognitively with the work. And the work has failed in that sense because the audience can't engage. My first counter-argument considers other forms of obstruction that could be posed to the audience in enjoying the work. I think there are many other forms of obstruction, and these obstructions, we don't see them as aesthetic flaws, which is why there is no prima facie reason for us to take moral flaws as a flaw. Suppose an avant-garde work in the early stages of the trend's emergence. Its avant-garde features could prevent many people from engaging with or even just understanding the work. However, these features are not necessarily considered aesthetic demerits. In fact, due to their experimentative nature, they're often considered merits. This is because it is pushing and expanding the boundaries of what people consider as art, and that is a form of defamiliarization. So next, let's consider a sculpture that's on a high mountain. By the literal fact of its physical location, this is an obstruction to people's enjoyment of the work because, well, a lot of people can't get there. Yet it would be kind of weird to say that it's an aesthetic demerit just by the fact that it's on a mountain, right? So it's really unclear why moral flaws in particular are considered flaws aesthetically just because, they obstruct responses. Another objection is that for the obstruction effect to actually take place, we need either number one, a practical assumption that everyone holds the most morally correct or virtuous values, or two, a normative assumption that everyone should hold these values. So basically, Noël Carroll's position known as moderate moralism suggests the former situation, and Berys Gaut's Ethicism promotes the latter position. So how do I attack this too? Well, I wish to say that the former position is just plainly not true as an empirical fact. Like, of course we know that not everyone holds the most virtuous or correct moral position. So the obstruction effect, even if we say that it takes place among the majority of the population, of course there is still a significant chunk of the population wherein it does not take place. There is no reason to assume that a work is aesthetically flawed just because it's only accessible to a minority. We have a lot of niche genres or experimental art forms that are similarly only accessible to a minority, and we rarely take that as an aesthetic demerit in itself. What about the normative assumption that people ought to have correct morality? Well, I think this is even less relevant to our discussion of art because it moves into a discussion of what are normatively correct values and what values people should hold, and that's completely irrelevant to art, really. That's considered the idea that it's problematic for art to promote immoral perspectives because as a medium, well, it skews the moral compass of society, and this is an idea that's been held by Plato and all the way still popular, in particular in the Victorian times. So as a very canonical example in the field of aesthetics, people talk about Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will as a morally defective work because it promotes Nazism. It's basically Nazi propaganda. Again, I think this issue circles back to the idea of what normative stance people should hold. And it takes art as an apparatus for promoting this whatever correct stance it is. I think the problem with this is that it's contradictory to the purpose of art, which I've defined in section 1. If we follow my definition, then this promoting whatever correct moral stance it is should not be a purpose of art. Even if that we accept it's problematic to promote these really bad extremist views like Nazism, it does not imply that we're able to hold this sort of blanket constraint on the sort of values that art is able to promote. Like, we can't just say, yes, we can dictate what art is able to promote. It's possible to say, yes, this artwork promotes problematic values, but I wouldn't say that it's artistically defective for such reasons. It is precisely this distinction between artistic and moral defects that I go on to discuss now. Let's talk about moderate autonomism. I'm quoting from Carroll. This position acknowledges that some art addresses ethical issues and may be assessed morally in terms of its ethical address, but this dimension of the work's value or disvalue is independent of its ethical value. Indeed, it is never the moral component of the criticism as such that diminishes or strengthens the value of an artwork qua artwork. Now, although the moderate autonomist thinks that ethical flaws cannot directly become aesthetic flaws, they do acknowledge that sometimes the legitimate aesthetic criticism of a work can surround aspects of the moral subject matter of a work, i.e., the moral content of a work can contribute to or detract from the aesthetic aspects of a work. To illustrate how this is possible despite the separation of the moral and aesthetic domains, I need to underline one key idea. We're treating the moral perspective of a work as its content and not part of its artistic execution. And this is the idea that I am now going to expand upon. Let's first consider what my opponents, as outlined in the previous section, would say. They would probably say that moral values are an integral part of a work because they are what is like evoking the cognitive affective responses. Okay, I agree with this. They do play an integral role in doing so because those moral perspectives are the work's content. And this term, content, I distinguish from artistic execution or artistic features. Art achieves defamiliarization via its artistic features. So that is basically presenting the familiar in an unfamiliar way to give us the aesthetic experience. And I quote this part from my essay: art cannot depart from real life, as presenting entirely foreign material is almost impossible and even if achieved, hardly able to evoke audience response. Yet it must rise above life, as any mundane representation without artistic execution would be no different from what we experience in the everyday and hence unable to provide us with aesthetic experience. Morality is among one of his choices as subject matter that is close to life. But let's say this artist chooses a moral perspective and he wants to do something artistic with it. Well, there's two scenarios. He could either succeed in achieving that or he could fail. And I would say the success or failure of him creating good art out of that material is completely irrelevant to the content that he's chosen. The only difference that content could make is to change the level of challenge presented to the executing artist. Some subject matters are much easier to evoke responses in audiences because people are well acquainted with or tend to have strong feelings towards it already, while others are harder to execute due to people's unfamiliarity or reluctance to accept a less adopted perspective. So let's suppose we're telling a story about a Native American tribe. It's rather hard to evoke a cognitive affective response in an audience of white middle-class American family just because they're just not familiar with that sort of life and less likely to be sympathetic towards experiences portrayed. However, we're not saying it's impossible to evoke good responses in audiences, just that it's harder. So another example, let's say we have a film advocating for black rights and it was aired half a century ago. Well, most of its audiences wouldn't respond very nicely to it because people were really racist back then. Would this failure of audience uptake indicate that it's aesthetically flawed? Well, I don't think that it would, because whether it's aesthetically flawed depends on whether it's a good film, artistically, right? So if we air the same thing right now, it's much more likely to elicit a more enthusiastic response, and hence it proves that it's not aesthetically flawed. Therefore, the reception of an artwork depends on a co-variation between its content and its artistic features. So when we consider works dealing with identical subject matters where some are very acclaimed while others deplored, this difference clearly lies in their difference in artistic execution. The key takeaway here, quoting from Gaut, to say that a prescribed response is unmerited is to say that the work is emotionally unengaging, but then the work's failure is a result of the failure to engage, and not of its ethical corruption. And another point why I think the separation between moral and aesthetic judgment is valuable and important is because this separation can salvage many aesthetically valuable works from the denial of their value because of their problematic morality. The idea is that we can appreciate a work despite of its immorality. A much contended example is Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. It's an American classic, but a lot of people have urged to ban it because it basically endorses and romanticizes black slavery in the plantations in the Confederate South before the Civil War. Although I acknowledge it is a moral flaw in the work, I think it is nevertheless a work of great aesthetic value due to the fact that it has an engaging storyline, vivid characters, and reveals so many insightful revelations about the struggles of a woman in a wartime. Now I wish to finally consider the question of how sometimes moral flaws can in fact become aesthetic merits. As Eaton writes, moral defects in a work can stage and solve an ambitious and artistically interesting problem, namely to overcome the audience's imaginative resistance. This sort of challenge is unique to morally flawed works, and to surmount it is a good demonstration of the artist's talent. This is consistent with what I've mentioned above, how fictional writers can choose easier or harder subjects to execute. By placing a moral flaw at the center of one's work, one is in a sense deliberately choosing a hard subject. They have given themselves the challenge of making the audience to feel things that they are strongly disinclined to feel. Therefore, they need to demonstrate greater dexterity in artistic skills such as portraying the situation with elegance or in a multifaceted way in order to overcome the imaginative resistance inherent in the audience population against these immoral sensibilities. A successful execution that evokes the desired cognitive affective response in the audience is undoubtedly a testament to the aesthetic merit of the work. There, I have fully presented my argument. I think moral flaws can never directly become aesthetic flaws. These are just completely two distinct realms that can't cross into each other. And I've addressed a lot of arguments that claim that they can. Morality can only work as content, not aesthetic features. And its influence on, the artistic merit is basically how hard or easy it makes the execution become. And of course, these are just my personal views on the subject, and I'm curious to hear if any of you guys have similar views or different views.